A. She had 4 seconds before the man who destroyed her life reached her across that ballroom floor, and Elizabeth Whitmore used every one of them to do the most reckless thing she had ever done in her life. She grabbed a stranger. She pressed herself against his chest like he was the last solid thing in a world that had already swallowed her whole. A. If you've ever had to fight to keep your dignity when someone tried to take everything from you, this story is for you. Subscribe, stay until the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. In the summer of 1818 sat heavy over Charleston. The South Carolina way a fever sits on a sick man thick, relentless, refusing to break no matter how hard you prayed for a wind off the harbor. Elizabeth Whitmore had not wanted to attend the governor's summer assembly. She had told her cousin Margaret as much on the carriage ride over, twice, in plain English, using words that left no room for misunderstanding. "I would rather sit home and watch the candles burn down to nothing," Elizabeth had said. "I would rather reorganize every drawer in the house. I would rather do anything, Margaret. Anything at all. Walk into that room and let those people look at me." Margaret had patted her hand, the way people pat the hands of someone they have already decided not to listen to. "You cannot hide forever, Lizzie. 3 years is long enough." "3 years isn't long enough for Charleston," Elizabeth said flatly. Nothing is long enough for Charleston. And she had been right. She knew it the moment they stepped through the double doors of the governor's hall, and the air shifted, that particular quality of silence that descends over a crowded room when something interesting walks in. Not silence exactly. More like the sound of 100 conversations dimming by half a degree. Eyes cutting sideways, fans pausing mid-flutter. The particular practiced art of pretending not to stare while staring completely. Felt every single one of those glances like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. She kept her chin up. She had learned that much in 3 years. Whatever she was feeling, and she was feeling quite a lot, none of it could be allowed to reach her face. "Not here, not in front of these people. You see?" Margaret murmured beside her, squeezing her arm. "No one is going to say anything terrible. You look beautiful. The blue suits you. Just breathe and oh, the Harrington family is here. I heard he's been up from his estate in Beaufort County, dealing with some inheritance business. Very respected man, they say he." Elizabeth stopped listening. Not because Margaret wasn't talking. Margaret was always talking. Margaret had been talking continuously for approximately 31 years, and showed no signs of slowing. Elizabeth stopped listening, because across the length of that glittering, lantern-lit room, through the swirl of silk dresses and dress coats and carefully powdered hair, she saw him. Nathaniel Caldwell. He was standing near the far window with a glass of wine in his hand, smiling at something the woman beside him had said, a woman Elizabeth recognized as the youngest daughter of the Beaumont family, wealthy, pretty, and possessing the kind of untouched reputation that Charleston society treated like currency. He looked exactly the same. That was the worst part, she thought distantly. That was the part that hit her, like stepping off a stair she didn't know was missing. He looked completely, utterly, infuriatingly the same. Handsome in that easy, uncomplicated way, relaxed in the way of a man who had never once lost a night's sleep over anything he had done. Dark hair was combed back neatly, his coat fit perfectly. He was laughing at something, his head tilting back, and the woman beside him was looking up at him with the expression of someone who believed everything he told her without question. Elizabeth knew that expression. She had worn it herself once. She did not know how long she stood there. Long enough for Margaret to notice she had gone completely rigid. Long enough for the blood to drain from her fingertips. Long enough to register, her, with a cold, dropping certainty that Nathaniel's gaze had begun moving across the room in that slow, social way, the way of a man who knows everyone and expects to be known, and that it was moving in her direction. He hadn't seen her yet. He would. In approximately 4 seconds. By her estimate, the eyes were going to land on Elizabeth Whitmore, The woman he had spent the better part of 3 years describing to everyone who would listen as unstable, other, emotional, impossible. Dramatic, the woman he had left, publicly and with great apparent reluctance, because she had made his life too difficult to bear. And when his eyes found hers, every person in that room was going to watch. And they were all going to remember exactly who they had been told she was. Elizabeth's mind moved, the way it moved in moments of genuine crisis, very quickly and very quietly, with a kind of cold clarity that surprised her, sometimes, because it felt nothing like the rest of her. She could not walk out. She had already walked in, had already been seen arriving, and leaving immediately would be its own spectacle, its own story, the kind that would be repeated over breakfast tables for a week. She could not hide. There was nowhere to go. The room was not large enough, and she was already standing near the center of it. She could not simply stand there and let it happen. Her eyes swept the room in one sharp, practiced movement. And she saw him. He was standing near the fireplace, slightly apart from the nearest cluster of guests, holding a glass he didn't appear to be drinking from. Tall, dark coat. The kind of stillness about him that was not shyness, more like a man who was comfortable enough in his own skin that he didn't feel the need to fill the silence with movement. She did not know his name. She did not know his family. She could not have told anyone afterward what his face looked like, not in that first half-second, because she wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at the space directly beside him, which was critically facing away from Nathaniel Caldwell. Elizabeth did not make the decisions so much as find that it had already been made somewhere behind her conscious thought. Walked, not fast enough to look like she was fleeing. Not slow enough to give Nathaniel's eyes time to catch her. Directly, across the floor, past the woman in the yellow dress. Past the group of men discussed something about the harbor trade. Past the table with the cut crystal glasses arranged in precise rows. The man by the fireplace had time to register that someone was approaching him. Had time to straighten slightly, to begin to turn, to open his mouth to say something polite. He did not have time to say it, because Elizabeth Whitmore put her arms around him. Not a brush, not a light ambiguous could have been accidental touch. She pressed her face against the lapel of his coat, both her arms wrapping around him firmly and deliberately, in the unmistakable gesture of a woman greeting someone she knew very well. Someone she was genuinely glad to see, someone whose presence was a relief to her. She felt him go absolutely still. The room went with him, or a significant portion of it. She could feel it, the collective pause, the redirected attention, that particular quality of interested silence spreading outward from them, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. She did not move. She kept her face pressed against his coat, and she counted, silently, the way she had counted in the carriage, the way she had learned to count when the world was too loud and she needed something to hold on to. 1. She heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching and then crucially, blessedly altering course. Not stopping, passing. 2. She heard someone nearby clear their throat in the gentle performative way of a person pretending they hadn't just witnessed something surprising. 3. She heard the woman in the conversation closest to them continue speaking, which meant the general interest was already beginning to redistribute itself to other things. Because that was the nature of these gatherings, nothing held their attention for very long when nothing dramatic appeared to be happening. Elizabeth loosened her arms. She stepped back. She made herself look up, and she met the eyes of the man she had just used as a human shield. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read, not angry, which surprised her, not embarrassed exactly, not amused. Something more careful than any of those things. His eyes were dark and steady, and they were looking at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand quickly, because he suspects understanding it quickly may matter. "I apologize," Elizabeth said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Made it stronger. "I apologize. I had no right to do that without your I am sorry." She stopped, drew one breath. "I am sorry. It was not well done of me." He looked at her for another moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly so that only she could hear it, "Did it work?" "Nee." She blinked. "Nah." "Did it work?" "And," he repeated, with the same careful, measuring calm. "Whatever you were trying to avoid. Did it work?" Elizabeth glanced sideways carefully, just a fraction, so it looked like nothing more than a casual shift of her gaze. Nathaniel Caldwell was across the room, his back partially to her now, deep in what appeared to be a conversation with the Beaumont girl's father. He had not looked her way, or if he had, she had missed it, which was nearly as good. "Yes," she said. "I believe it did." "Good," the man said. And then he did something that surprised her entirely. He offered her his arm, not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just a slight turn of his body and the quiet, actus gesture of a man who was very used to social situations requiring him to appear exactly as expected. "Then I suggest we make it convincing. There are at least 4 people in this room looking at us right now, and they will be considerably more convinced if we appear to be continuing a conversation rather than concluding an emergency." Elizabeth stared at him for a half-second. Then she put her hand on his arm. "Either very kind," she said carefully, "or you have your own reasons for this." "I am not sure those are mutually exclusive," he said. He began to walk slowly, the unhurried pace of 2 people with nowhere in particular to be, and every intention of taking their time about getting there. "I don't know your name," Elizabeth said, still keeping her voice low, her face arranged in the expression of pleasant conversation. "William Harrington," he said. The name landed somewhere in the back of her mind with a small, distinct weight. She knew that name, not well, not the way she knew the names of families she'd grown up among. But she knew it the way she knew all the names that circulated through Charleston's careful social geography heard at dinner tables, mentioned in the context of land holdings, business dealings, the quiet, solid kind of reputation that didn't advertise itself. She knew it well enough to understand, ever, with a sudden, unpleasant clarity, exactly what she had just done. "Oh," she said. "Yes," he said pleasantly. She stopped. "Reorganized. You're the Harrington from Beaufort." "Same. The one with the..." She stopped again. "Custody matter. That's been in the I heard." "Also the same," he said. His voice had not changed. It remained exactly as measured and calm as it had been. That was somehow more alarming than if he had gotten angry. "The hearing is in 3 weeks. There are a number of people in this room tonight who have an opinion about whether a bachelor of 34 is a suitable guardian for a child. I have been working quite carefully for several months to assure them that I am a person of stable and respectable character." Elizabeth felt the understanding move through her like cold water. She began. "Embraced me," he said, in front of approximately half of Charleston society. Without introduction, without apparent warning, in a manner that could generously be described as intimate. She closed her eye exactly 1 second. "I am so sorry," she said. "Mr. Harrington, I am genuinely deeply sorry. I did not think I saw him, and I only had a moment, and I didn't. I will fix this. Explain anyone you need me into exto. It was entirely my fault that you had no idea that." William said. Elizabeth paused. "I beg your pardon." "The man you were avoiding." He was still walking at the same unhurried pace. His expression, as far as she could judge from her peripheral vision, had not shifted. She was quiet for a moment. "Nathaniel Caldwell," she said finally. William Harrington was silent for a few steps. "Then I see." "You know him?" "I know of him," William said. "Most people in this state do." There was something in the way he said it that she couldn't quite place, not contempt exactly, but something that was related to contempt the way a cousin is related to family. Something that recognized a type without being willing to say so plainly. "Then you know what people say about me," Elizabeth said. She said it evenly, because she had learned to say it evenly. In connection with him. "I know what people have said," William agreed. "I did not say I had formed an opinion." She looked at him directly then, for the first time since they'd begun walking. Most people have. I'm not most people, he said simply, as if this were a fact of no particular significance. He made a circuit of the room, appearing to anyone watching like two acquaintances, engaged in pleasant conversation. And then, William steered them toward a pair of chairs slightly removed from the nearest group, not so far removed as to appear antisocial, but far enough that conversation would not be easily overheard. He waited until they were seated before he spoke again. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I am going to be direct with you, because I think it will serve us both better than the alternative. What happened tonight will be discussed. It may have already been discussed. By tomorrow morning it will have reached people who were not in this room. And by the end of the week it will have become," he paused, "something more than it was." "I know," Elizabeth said quietly. "One of two things needs to happen," William continued. "Either I tell the truth that you are a stranger who startled me in a moment of distress, which will protect my reputation at the cost of entirely destroying yours." "I understand," she said. Her voice was steady. She had had 3 years of practice at keeping her voice steady. "I wouldn't ask you to," he said, and the word fell into the conversation with a particular deliberateness. "We provide a different explanation." Elizabeth went still. "A temporary engagement," William said. Announced quietly, but confirmed if asked. "Long enough to provide a satisfactory explanation for tonight. Long enough for the custody hearing to conclude. And long enough, if I understand the situation correctly, to complicate Mr. Caldwell's particular version of events considerably." The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise exactly. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of something large and trying to determine whether the ground beneath them was solid. "Why would you do that?" Elizabeth said at last. William looked at her. Because I need to win a custody hearing in 3 weeks," he said. "Because I have a niece who is 9 years old and has already lost too much, and I will not lose her too, because I was not willing to make a pragmatic decision when I had the chance. And because of nothing else," Elizabeth said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And because the look on your face when you saw him across that room was the look of someone who has been fighting for a very long time and was very tired." Elizabeth did not say anything. "I recognize it," William said simply. "I've worn it." She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. Thought about what Margaret would say. Thought about what her mother would have said. Thought about what Charleston would say. Whatever they decided, they would say something. They always said something. She had stopped being able to control that long ago. "8 months," she said. 6 months, he agreed, "and at the end of it we terminate the arrangement amicably." She made herself say it cleanly, practically. Incompatibility. Different visions for the future. Nothing that damages either party further. Agreed. "And before I agree to anything else," Elizabeth said, "I need to tell you something. About Nathaniel Caldwell. About what actually happened 3 years ago." She lifted her eyes to his. "Because if you are going to attach your name to mine in any capacity, even temporarily, you deserve to know exactly what you're attaching it to." William Harrington looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "Tell me." And Elizabeth Whitmore, who had not told the full truth to anyone in 3 years, because no one had sat still long enough to hear it, opened her mouth and began. She started at the beginning. She told him about her father's illness, the long, slow, terrible unraveling of a man who had once been the backbone of everything. A declining over 18 months into someone who could not manage accounts or correspondence or the daily business of running an estate. She told him how Nathaniel had appeared during that time, presenting himself as a family friend, capable young man with experience in property management. Someone who could take the burden from Elizabeth's shoulders during the worst of it. "He was kind," she said, "in the beginning. Genuinely kind, I think, or I don't know anymore. I've gone back so many times I can no longer tell what was real and what was performance. I believed it. I believed he was there to help." She told him about the documents. Not a single dramatic signing, nothing so obvious as that. A series of small things over many months. Papers that needed Elizabeth's signature because her father was no longer capable. management agreements, property assessments, correspondence she hadn't read carefully enough because she'd been sitting up through the nights with her father, and her eyes wouldn't focus properly by morning. Never lied to me directly, she said. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Every individual thing he said was technically true. The documents were what he said they were. The agreements were what he described them as. But the picture they made together, the way they were arranged, she shook her head. The time my father died, and I had the chance to look at everything clearly, so much had shifted. Quietly, legally, in ways that were very difficult to challenge because on the surface everything appeared to be in order. She told him about the end. About the evening she had confronted Nathaniel not gracefully, no, not with the careful, measured language she might have used if she'd had more sleep and less grief, but openly, everything she felt showing on her face. Her voice unsteady with anger and loss and the particular desperation of someone who sees what is happening but cannot prove it. He was very calm, she said. He listened to everything I said. And then he told me, very gently, that he was worried about me. That he'd noticed for some time that the stress of my father's illness had been affecting me. That he'd wanted to say something sooner, but hadn't wanted to distress me further. She had known in that moment, she said, exactly what he was doing. She had seen it happening, and had not been able to stop it like watching a carriage go off a road in slow motion too far away to grab the reins. Then he left, Elizabeth said, publicly, with great apparent sadness. And the story was already written before I understood what story he was telling. She paused. He said I was unstable. He said he had tried to help me and found it was not possible. Her voice hitched slightly. She controlled it. He said he hoped I would find peace. The word peace landed in the air between them with a particular ugliness. Everyone believed him, she said. Not everyone, William said. Enough, she said. Enough that it didn't matter. Annie, these continued around them. Music had started somewhere, a string quartet in the next room, and the gentle swell of it drifted through. Glasses clinked, voices rose and fell. Someone laughed at something across the room. Elizabeth waited. She had said the whole of it now. She had laid it out plainly, and, without embellishment, without the careful editing she had learned to apply when the subject came up, and she was aware, sitting here, that she had not done that with anyone. That she had told parts to Margaret, parts to her solicitor, parts to herself in the dark, when she couldn't sleep. But not the whole of it, assembled in one place, said plainly from beginning to end. It felt, she found, rather like having taken off a coat she had been wearing for so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her. She waited for William Harrington to say something gracious and distancing. Tell her that he was sorry for her trouble. To begin the careful process of reconsidering. He said, "Show me the documents." Elizabeth blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The management agreements. The property papers." He said it the same way he said everything quietly, without particular emphasis, as though this were simply the next practical step and he was merely naming it. "Whatever you have, show me." Why? Because a man who controls a story by controlling the truth, William said, has usually left a paper trail somewhere. They always believe the paper will protect them, because the paper is what makes it look legal. His eyes met hers. But paper can also tell a different story, if someone knows what they're looking at. Elizabeth stared at him. "Do you have the documents?" he asked. She said slowly, "I kept everything. My solicitor advised me to, but we couldn't find that there were gaps, inconsistencies, but nothing that." "All right," William said. He glanced briefly across the room toward the cluster, where Nathaniel Caldwell still stood, now apparently deeply entertained by a story the Beaumont patriarch was telling. He looked back at Elizabeth. "6 months," he said again. "And I will need to tell you about Clara, my niece. If we are going to do this convincingly, you will need to know her." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who is she?" And William Harrington, who had not told the full truth to many people either, because the world had not always been kind to the truths he told, looked down at the glass in his hand and began. Clara was 9 years old. She was the daughter of William's younger sister Anne, who had died 14 months ago of fever quickly, terribly, without enough warning for any of them to prepare. Anne's husband had followed her 6 months later, taken by the same illness, and Clara had come to live with William because there was no one else, and because William had promised Anne, the last time he saw her coherent, that he would not let her daughter disappear into some institution or distant relation's household who regarded her as an obligation. "She is quiet," William said. "She was quiet before Anne died. She is quieter now. She has watched too many adults pretend things are fine when they are not, and she has developed," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "a talent for seeing through it. She knows when people are performing for her benefit, and she does not trust it. She doesn't say so. She is 9, but you can see it in her face." "What does she need?" Elizabeth asked. William looked at her. "That's an unusual question. It seems like the relevant one." He was quiet a moment. "She needs someone who won't pretend," he said at last. "She needs the world to make sense in some small portion. She needs..." Started again. "She needs to believe that the people around her are telling her the truth. That when they say things will be all right, they are not simply managing her feelings because they don't know what else to do." Elizabeth thought about that for a moment. "I can do that," she said. William looked at her with that same careful, measuring expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of genuine attention. "Can you? I am extremely good at telling the truth," Elizabeth said. "It is, in fact, the habit that has caused most of my problems." Something moved across his face, then too fast to name, but not nothing. 6 months, he said again. 6 months, she agreed. They shook hands, quietly, under the drift of string music and the soft noise of 100 conversations, in the middle of the governor's summer assembly, while Nathaniel Caldwell laughed at something across the room and didn't look at them once. It was the most significant agreement Elizabeth had made since the one she'd signed without reading carefully enough 3 years ago. This time, she understood exactly what she was signing. Outside, later, in the carriage home, Margaret, beside her, asking 20 questions she wasn't answering, Elizabeth looked out at the dark road and allowed herself, privately, feel something she had not permitted herself to feel in a very long time. Not hope. She was not ready for hope. Hope was a thing that required a certain amount of trust in the future, and she had not rebuilt that yet. But something like it, something that was to hope of what a single coal is to a fire, small, specific, and currently sufficient. It was enough, she thought, to build from. She would see. The carriage ride back to William Harrington's townhouse on Elm Street took 11 minutes. 8 counted them. She sat across from Margaret, who had finally run out of questions somewhere around the 3rd minute and had settled into a particular kind of pointed silence that communicated, very clearly, that she had not run out of opinions, merely the energy to deliver them all at once. To save them. Margaret was disciplined that way. Elizabeth looked out at the dark road and thought about what she had just agreed to. 6 months. A temporary engagement to a man she had met 45 minutes ago. Anne, a man who, by her best recollection, had not raised his voice once, had not made a single dramatic pronouncement. And had responded to having a stranger wrap her arms around him in the middle of the governor's summer assembly by asking, calmly, whether it had worked. She was either making the most practical decision of her life or the most catastrophic one. She had some experience with the distance between those two things. "Lizzie," Margaret said. "Don't," Elizabeth said. "I haven't said anything." "You're about to." Margaret was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Is he?" "William Harrington," Elizabeth said. "In Beaufort." The silence that followed had a different quality to it. Margaret was a woman
who paid close attention to names,
and she was paying attention to this one, now turning it over, placing it in its proper position in the social landscape she kept carefully mapped in her head. "One with the custody matter," Margaret said finally. "Lizzie," Margaret's voice had shifted, not harder. "Something more careful than hard. What did you do?" Elizabeth turned from the window and looked at her cousin directly. Margaret was 41 years old and had outlasted 2 husbands and approximately 9 separate social catastrophes, and she had the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things some years ago. Could still be alarmed. It was alarmed now. "I made an arrangement," Elizabeth said. "An arrangement," Margaret repeated. "Harrington. A temporary one. 6 months. For mutual benefit." The carriage hit a rut in the road. Margaret grabbed the strap. "Does he understand what he's agreed to? Do you understand what you've agreed to? Lizzie, that man has a custody hearing in 3 weeks. I know." Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap. "That's rather the point." Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Nathaniel is going to find out." "Nathaniel is find out by tomorrow morning," Elizabeth said. "That's also rather the point." Another silence. Then Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a prayer and looked out her own window at the passing dark. "You'd better know what you're doing," she said. "I rarely do," Elizabeth said, "but I'm doing it anyway." That was the end of that conversation. The arrangement, as they had agreed to call it, required one immediate and practical step. Elizabeth needed to meet Clara. William had been direct about this the night before. Not demanding he wasn't a man who led with demands, she was beginning to understand. He stated facts and let other people do what they wished with them. The fact he had stated was this: Clara had been through enough upheaval that introducing a new person into her daily life required care. She did not adjust easily, she did not trust easily. And, if Elizabeth was going to be in the house, in whatever capacity, even temporarily, it needed to be handled honestly. "I won't lie to her, Nan," William had said, in the carriage doorway, after walking Elizabeth out at the end of the evening. "About any of it. I won't tell her you're something you're not." Her. Elizabeth had asked. He had thought about it for a moment. "The truth. That you and I have an agreement, that you'll be staying for a time." "Did I trust you?" Elizabeth had looked at him. "You trust me? You've known me for 2 hours." "Yeah. I've known you long enough to know you told me the truth when you didn't have to," he said. "That's sufficient for now." She had not known what to say to that. No, she had said good night and gotten in the carriage and thought about it the entire way home. She arrived at William's town house the following afternoon at 3 o'clock, exactly as arranged, wearing the dark green dress because Margaret had said it made her look steady, and she needed to look steady, carrying nothing except her reticule and 3 years of accumulated composure. Housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, a woman of about 60 with the bearing of someone who had run complicated households for a long time and was not easily impressed by anything, opened the door and regarded Elizabeth for exactly 1 moment before stepping back to admit her. "Mr. Harrington is in the study," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Miss Clara is in the garden." Elizabeth glanced toward the back of the house. "Is she expecting me?" "She knows a guest is coming, Mrs. Aldridge said. The slight emphasis on the word guest told Elizabeth very clearly that Mrs. Aldridge was a woman who noticed things and was reserving judgment. Mr. Harrington said, "You might want to meet her before he joins you." Elizabeth considered this. "Then yes, I think I would." Mrs. Aldridge led her through the house and out through the rear door, and Elizabeth stepped into what she could feel was a well-maintained garden without looking at it too carefully. Because what she was looking at was the child sitting on the bench near the far wall. Clara Harrington was small for 9, or perhaps she simply held herself compactly, knees together, hands folded, the posture of a child, who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She had her uncle's dark coloring and something about the set of her jaw that was purely her own. She was looking at Elizabeth with an expression that was not unfriendly and not welcoming. It was assessing, the way the eyes of someone who has been surprised too many times tend to be measuring the situation before committing to a reaction. Elizabeth walked over and sat down on the opposite end of the bench without being invited. Watched her do it. "You're Miss Whitmore," Clara said. "I am," Elizabeth said. "Uncle William said you were coming. He told me about you as well." Clara looked at her steadily. "Eh? What did he say?" "That you're 9 years old," Elizabeth said. "That you're quiet. And that you're very good at knowing when adults aren't telling the truth." Something moved through Clara's expression, not quite surprise. More like the recognition of someone hearing their own name spoken correctly for the first time. "Most adults don't say that," Clara said. "Most adults don't think it's something worth saying," Elizabeth agreed. "I happen to disagree." Clara was quiet for a moment. She had a way of sitting with silence that was unusual for a child, not uncomfortable, not fidgeting. Just waiting. "Are you going to marry my uncle?" she asked. Elizabeth looked at her. The honest answer was complicated. The dishonest answer was easy. She thought about what Williams had said, "I won't lie to her," and found that she agreed with it so completely she couldn't have said the dishonest answer, even if she'd tried. "I don't know," Elizabeth said. "What I know right now is that your uncle and I have agreed to spend some time in each other's company. Beyond that," she paused. "Beyond that, I think neither of us is certain." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing a grown-up has said to me in a year." Elizabeth felt something move in her chest. Not quite pain. Added to it. "Then I'll keep at it," she said. They sat there for a few minutes in the afternoon warmth, not talking about anything significant. And Elizabeth thought that this was perhaps the most straightforward conversation she had had in years, simpler and more honest than anything that had happened in the Governor's Assembly the night before, simpler than the arrangement she had made, simpler than the story she was now going to have to live inside. A 9-year-old girl who could tell when adults were lying had looked at her and decided she was acceptable. That was, she found, more steadying than she expected. When William came out to find them, and 20 minutes later, they were discussing Clara's preference in books, and Clara was explaining, with considerable conviction, that ghost stories were misunderstood as a genre and people dismissed them too quickly on account of not reading the right ones. Elizabeth was saying, with equal conviction, that she had read exactly one ghost story as a child and had not slept properly for a week. Clara told her she had simply read the wrong one. William stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. Nanner. His expression, Elizabeth noticed from the corner of her eye. Mushin was the same careful, measuring look she was becoming familiar with. But there was something underneath it now. Something quieter, something that looked, if she was not imagining it, rather like relief. He said nothing about it. He walked over, in the chair across from the bench, and said, "Clara, are you frightening Miss Whitmore with your theories about ghost stories?" "Educating her," Clara said. "I stand corrected," William said gravely. That was how it began. The announcement was handled the following morning. Not a formal declaration. They had agreed that anything too grand would invite scrutiny, and scrutiny was the last thing either of them needed. William sent 3 letters. One to his solicitor, one to his business partner, a man named Forsyth who managed the Beaufort land holdings and would need to know. One to his closest friend in Charleston, a man called Reverend Dames, whose good opinion carried weight in the circles that mattered most for the custody hearing. Letters were careful. They stated the facts. Mr. William Harrington and Miss Elizabeth Whitmore had reached an understanding and intended to formalize it in due course. Nothing more was said, because nothing more needed to be said. The social mechanism of Charleston would do the rest. By evening of that same day, Elizabeth received a call from Mrs. Henry Beaumont, not the mother, the aunt. Mrs. Beaumont, the aunt, was 63 years old, had been a fixture of Charleston society for 40 years, and had the particular kind of authority that comes not from wealth or title but from simply having been present and paying attention longer than anyone else. She arrived at Margaret's house, where Elizabeth was still staying at 4 o'clock with no advance notice, which was, in its own way, a statement. Margaret let her in because one did not decline to let Mrs. Beaumont in. Elizabeth came downstairs. Mrs. Beaumont looked at her the way she had probably looked at everything for 60 years, directly, without apology, and with complete attention. "Eton, child," she said. Elizabeth sat. "I am going to ask you something, Mrs. Beaumont said, and I would like you to answer it honestly, because I have very little patience for anything else at my age, and I have found it saves considerable time." "All right," Elizabeth said. "Are you using William Harrington?" The directness of it was almost refreshing. Almost. Elizabeth met the older woman's eyes. "We have an arrangement that benefits us both," she said. "If that is what you mean by using, then yes, but I am not deceiving him about it." Understands exactly what it is and entered into it freely. Mrs. Beaumont studied her. "And the child, Clara?" "I like her," Elizabeth said simply, without decoration. And shifted in Mrs. Beaumont's expression. Not softening exactly. Something more like the recognition of someone who has heard the ring of genuine feeling and knows it when it comes. "There are people in this town," Mrs. Beaumont said carefully, "who are going to attempt to use this arrangement against the custody case. They are going to say that a woman of your reputation—" She paused delicately. "Say it plainly," Elizabeth said. "That a woman with your history is not a suitable influence on a child. That William's judgment in forming this connection speaks poorly of his own fitness to provide a stable home." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "Then who?" Mrs. Beaumont's expression didn't change, but her eyes moved a small, precise flicker, the kind that was not quite an answer, and not quite a refusal to answer. "The Caldwell family has certain interests in the Harrington estate holdings," she said instead. "And that adjoins a boundary dispute that has been managed quietly for some years." Elizabeth felt the understanding arrive cold and certain, the way understanding tends to arrive when you already knew the shape of it and were only waiting for the name. "Nathaniel," she said. "His father is involved, Mrs. Beaumont said carefully. "Nathaniel, I would not say he is orchestrating. I would say he is not discouraging." Elizabeth looked at her hands. Flat on her knees, still. 3 years of practice in keeping herself still. "Of course he isn't," she said. "Miss Whitmore." Mrs. Beaumont's voice had changed slightly, lost a fraction of its social formality, gained something else in its place. Something that had been there all along under the structure of the visit, waiting. "I knew your mother." Elizabeth looked up. "I knew her well," the older woman said. "And I knew your father in the last years of his life." I knew. She paused. "I knew what that young Caldwell man was doing, or I suspected it, and I did not say enough. At the time I told myself there was nothing provable. There wasn't, but there was enough to say something." She set her hands flat on her own knees, the mirror image. "I should have said it." The room was very quiet. Elizabeth did not know what to do with that. It was the kind of thing she had wanted to hear someone say for 3 years, not as an apology exactly, but as a recognition. As the acknowledgement that someone else had seen it and had looked away, and knew they had looked away. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in front of Mrs. Beaumont. "It's done," she said. "There's no use in." "There is use," Mrs. Beaumont said, "because I am going to say it now. To the people it matters to. I have been present in this society for 40 years, and I have kept my opinions to myself more often than I should have, and I find that at 63, I have considerably less interest in keeping quiet than I used to." Elizabeth stared at her. "I am going to attend the custody hearing," Mrs. Beaumont said. "If I am asked about your character, I will speak to it." She stood slowly, with the unhurried dignity of someone who had been standing up from chairs for 6 decades and had made a practice of it. "I would suggest, Miss Whitmore, that you spend the next 3 weeks being exactly what you have apparently always been. Be honest, even when it cost you, especially when it cost you." She left. Elizabeth sat in Margaret's parlor for a long time after the door closed, listening to the sound of the house and thinking about what it meant when the truth had witnesses. She was at William's house the following morning at 9 o'clock. She had not planned to be. The arrangement had not specified mornings. But she had woken up at 6 with a very specific thought: the documents. The papers from her father's estate, the management agreements, the property assessments, everything she had kept, everything she had given her solicitor, everything she had not been able to make add up to a legible story on her own. She had bundled all of it into a leather satchel and arrived on William Harrington's doorstep with it tucked under her arm. Mrs. Aldridge opened the door, looked at the satchel, and said, "Nan, he's in the study." William was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, not surprised, particularly in the way of someone who had been expecting her arrival eventually and had simply not known the precise timing. "The documents," Elizabeth said, setting the satchel on the edge of his desk. "You wanted to see them." He looked at the satchel. At her. "I did. There are a lot of them," she said. "Some I understand, some I don't. My solicitor went through them with me 3 times and found the inconsistencies, but couldn't find the..." She stopped. "Couldn't find the thread. The thing that would make it legible. That would make it a story someone could follow." William was already reaching for the satchel. "Down," he said. "I don't need to sit. It's going to take a while," he said. "Sit down." She sat down, satchel, and began to go through the contents, the way someone goes through something they are looking at seriously, not quickly, not performing attention, but actually giving it. Methodical, reading each page before moving to the next. Occasionally setting something aside, occasionally going back to something he'd already passed. Elizabeth sat across the desk and watched him and did not say anything, because she recognized the quality of concentration he was bringing to it, and she did not want to interrupt it. After 30 minutes, he said, "This payment." He turned a page toward her. It was a record from an accounting ledger, one of several her solicitor had flagged. "The transfer to the land assessment firm," he said. "In October of 1815. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "My solicitor said it was consistent with standard practice. That firms of that type routinely..." "This firm, Nan," William said, "was dissolved in September of 1815. Elizabeth went still. "It ceased operations a month before this payment was made," William said. "Which means the money went somewhere. But it did not go to a functioning land assessment firm." The silence in the room had a different quality now. "I didn't know that," Elizabeth said quietly. "You couldn't have," William said. "It requires checking the registry of business operations, which is not a document a grieving daughter trying to manage an estate would naturally go looking for." "But Nathaniel would have known," she said. "Nathaniel arranged the payment," William said. He set the page down carefully. "He would have known exactly." Elizabeth's hands were very still in her lap. That's a thread," she said. "That's the beginning of one," William said. He looked up at her. "Maybe more. Anne, I need to look through the rest of this carefully, and I need to contact a man in Columbia who handles property law, someone who has dealt with boundary disputes in this county, and will know what to look for in the deed first." He paused. "This is going to take time, and it requires you to trust me with information that could also be used against you if someone wanted to use it that way." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "Could you use it against me?" "Yes," he said, "but you won't." Another silence. "Then we have a deal," Elizabeth said. He nodded. He went back to the documents. Clara appeared in the doorway of the study 20 minutes later, still in her morning dress, her dark hair not yet properly arranged, holding a book. Looked at Elizabeth, looked at her uncle, looked at the papers spread across the desk. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. "Working," William said without looking up. "Together?" "Yes." Clara considered this. Then she came into the room, sat in the chair in the corner, the small one that had "Problem" put there specifically because she favored it, and opened her book. She did not leave. Elizabeth glanced at William. He glanced at her. Nothing was said. As Elizabeth thought, a strangely ordinary morning, given that her entire life appeared to be in the process of being reassembled from pieces she hadn't known were salvageable. Ordinary, and somehow quietly all right. News that William Harrington's engagement to Elizabeth Whitmore reached Nathaniel Caldwell by Wednesday. Elizabeth knew this because by Thursday morning she received a visit. Not from Nathaniel, from his mother. Mrs. Adelaide Caldwell arrived at Margaret's house again. Elizabeth was at Margaret's, again without advance notice, which was beginning to feel like a pattern in her life. At 10 o'clock in the morning, wearing her best summer visiting dress and the expression of a woman who had decided on her position before leaving home. Margaret intercepted her at the door, unsuccessfully. Mrs. Caldwell found Elizabeth in the sitting room. "Miss Whitmore," she said, taking the chair across from the settee without being invited. "Mrs. Caldwell," Elizabeth said. She did not stand up. She had thought about this in the 30 seconds between hearing the knock at the door and hearing Margaret's voice in the hallway, and decided that she was finished with standing up for people who had done nothing to deserve it. Mrs. Caldwell noticed. Her expression tightened fractionally. "I will come directly to the point," Mrs. Caldwell said. Elizabeth said, "You are making a serious mistake." "That is a concern I'll consider carefully," Elizabeth said. Mrs. Caldwell's expression tightened further. "No." She was a handsome woman, late 50s, with the kind of face that had probably always been better suited to displeasure than to pleasure, the lines of it organized around judgment in a way that looked permanent. "William Harrington is not what he appears," Mrs. Caldwell said. "He has interests in this town, interests connected to land, to boundary questions, to matters that touch the Caldwell family's own holdings, and I would not be surprised if this arrangement of yours was designed specifically to—" "And to what?" Mrs. Caldwell stopped. "Designed to what exactly?" Elizabeth said. Her voice was quiet. It was the quiet of someone who has stopped being afraid of the answer. "To embarrass your family, to challenge your son's version of events. To suggest by implication that a woman your son publicly described as unstable has somehow managed to secure the attention of one of the most respected men in the state." She tilted her head very slightly. "Which of those possibilities concerns you most, Mrs. Oldwell?" The older woman's expression had gone rigid. "My son," she began. "Your son spent 3 years telling this town a story," Elizabeth said. "He told it carefully, and he told it well, and he used just enough of the truth to make it believable." It worked. She met the woman's eyes directly. "But the thing about stories, Mrs. Caldwell, is that they can be corrected." The silence that followed was the kind that means something has shifted and everyone in the room knows it. Mrs. Caldwell rose. She said nothing else. She moved to the door, and then she paused, one hand on the frame, and said, without turning around, "You should be very careful, Miss Whitmore, about what you think you can prove." "I'm not interested in what I can prove," Elizabeth said. Mrs. Caldwell turned, just enough to look back at her. "I'm interested in the truth," Elizabeth said. "Those aren't always the same thing." "But they're getting closer together." Mrs. Caldwell left. Margaret appeared in the doorway, approximately 4 seconds later. She had clearly been in the hallway for some portion of that conversation. "Lizzie," she said. "Don't," Elizabeth said. "That woman is going to go straight to Nathaniel." "No, and Nathaniel is going to, I know, Margaret." Elizabeth stood. Her hands were perfectly steady. "I know exactly what Nathaniel is going to do. He's going to feel the ground shift, and he's going to move. Quickly and carefully, and in a way that looked from the outside." She picked up her reticule from the side table. "Which is why I need to get to William's house." She was out the door in 3 minutes. William read her account of the visit without interrupting. He was standing at the window of his study. She had arrived to find him there. As though the morning had been too restless to allow for sitting. And he listened with that particular quality of attention, was simply how he listened to things that mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Then he's going to make a move against the custody case," he said. "Yes, before the hearing. Something that gets submitted to the court. Something that introduces questions about my judgment." "Association with me," Elizabeth said. "Yes." He turned from the window. "Let him." She stared at him. "William, let him make the move," William said. His voice was still calm, still measured. But underneath it there was something that had not been there before, something that was not quite anger and not quite certainty, but was built from both of them, solid and specific. I have been looking at your documents all week. I sent a letter to my man in Colombia yesterday, and I received a reply this morning. Elizabeth felt the air in the room change. What did he find? She said. William crossed to the desk. He picked up a single page of letter. She could see the handwriting from where she stood and looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. Dissolved firm, he said. The one that received the payment in October 1815. It had two principals. He set the letter down flat on the desk, facing her, and pointed to two names written in his correspondent's clear hand. One of them died 1816. The other one is currently a partner in Nathaniel Caldwell's father's primary business venture. The room was very, very quiet. Elizabeth walked to the desk. She looked at the name. She had never seen it before. She did not know it. But she understood it with the sudden, absolute clarity of something falling into place after years of being slightly wrong, exactly what it meant. He didn't just ship the story, she said. No, William said. He arranged the situation. She heard her own voice from what felt like a slight distance. That, precise. He arranged the money, the disappearance. Knowing what it would look like. Knowing what it would do. Yes, that's not bending the truth. She looked up from the letter. That's building a lie that wears the truth's clothing. William said again. He was watching her, not with pity. With something more direct than that, the attention of someone who was watching to see how a person they were beginning to trust handled the arrival of the thing they'd been waiting 3 years to hear. Elizabeth breathed. In, out. She sat down in the chair in front of his desk, the chair she had come to think of as hers. In the 3 weeks since this had all started, and she put her hands flat on the desk and looked at the letter and the name and thought about everything it meant and everything it was going to cost to go further. All right, she said finally. All right, William said. All right. She looked up at him. We are going to do what you suggested. We are going to bring this to the court. Not just defend your fitness to raise Clara. We are going to take this, she gestured at the letter, at the satchel full of documents, at all of it, into that courtroom, and let the truth be a little louder than it has been. William looked at her for a moment, and he did something she had not seen him do before, in the weeks they had spent carefully, practically, constructing this arrangement of theirs. He smiled, not a social smile, not the measured, appropriate expression he wore in company. Something smaller and more real than that, the kind of smile that arrives without calculation, before a person has time to decide whether they want to show it. It disappeared almost immediately. He was not a man who let his face carry things for long. But she had seen it. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she agreed. And, somewhere across town, in the room he was never careful in, because he had never needed to be, Nathaniel Caldwell was beginning to understand that, for the first time, that the woman he had reduced to a story was no longer willing to be one. The hearing was in 2 weeks. Elizabeth knew this, the way she knew her own heartbeat, not by looking at a clock, but by feeling it constant and present, underneath everything else she did. 2 weeks. 14 days. The number sat in the back of every conversation, every document she reviewed with William. Every morning she arrived at his house with the leather satchel and stayed until the light changed. The work had settled into a rhythm. Neither of them had planned, and neither of them questioned. William went through the documents in the order Elizabeth's solicitor had originally organized them, but he was looking for different things, not the inconsistencies themselves, which they already knew existed, but the connective tissue between them. The pattern. The proof that what had looked like a series of unfortunate mismanagements was, in fact, a single deliberate architecture. It was slow work. It was the kind of slow that felt like pressing on a bruise, necessary and clarifying and painful, in a way that didn't go away when you stopped pressing. Elizabeth helped where she could, and stayed out of the way where she couldn't, which was harder than it sounded, because staying out of the way was not something she had ever done naturally. For her part, she had taken to appearing in the study every morning, at approximately 10 o'clock, with a book she never quite read. Sitting in her corner chair, with the quiet attention of someone who was watching something important happen, and had decided the most useful thing she could do was not interrupt it. Elizabeth had not told her what they were doing, not exactly. But Clara had not asked. She had a child's instinct for the shape of things, even when the details were withheld, and she seemed to understand in the way she understood most things more than she was given credit for. On the Tuesday, 9 days before the hearing, Elizabeth arrived to find William already at his desk, with 3 new pages spread across it. He had been there since early morning. By the look of him, his coat was over the chair, and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had the particular focused stillness of someone who had found something. "Sit down," he said, before she had fully crossed the threshold. She sat. "I wrote to the county recorder's office in Columbia last week," he said. He did not look up from the pages, asked them to pull the deed transfer records for 3 specific parcels, the ones your father's estate signed in 1815 and 1816. The ones that appeared in the accounting ledger under the assessment firm that had already dissolved. Elizabeth said carefully, "The recorder's office sent back copies this morning." He turned one of the pages toward her. "Look at the witness signatures." Elizabeth leaned forward. She looked at the 2 signatures at the bottom of the deed transfer. She recognized her own solicitor at the time, a man named Purvis who had since retired and moved to Georgia. The other was a name she did not recognize. "I don't know this signature," she said. "No," William said, "but I do." He finally looked up. His eyes were steady and his voice was steady, and the thing underneath both of them was not. "That signature belongs to a man named Robert Cleary, who, as of 1815, was a clerk in the office of Caldwell Sr.'s primary legal firm." The room went very quiet. Elizabeth looked at the signature again. Then back at William. "He put his own man on the deed transfer," she said. "As witness," William said. "Technically legal. Clerks commonly served as witnesses. Nothing irregular about the position itself." He paused. "Except that a clerk in Caldwell's firm, witnessing a property transfer that benefited Caldwell's partner in the dissolved assessment company is." "It's a chain," Elizabeth said. She heard her own voice from a slight distance, the way she always did when something important was assembling itself in her head. "It's a chain of people. The dissolved firm, the Caldwell business partner, the clerk witness. Each link looks plausible on its own. Until you put them together," William said. "Until you put them together," she agreed. She sat with it for a moment. The names. The 3 years of everyone around her, treating this as the story of a woman who had lost control of herself at a bad time and made poor decisions. The story of someone to be pitied, or judged, or more commonly simply moved past, the way you move past something unfortunate on the side of a road. She had not lost control. That was what the paper trail said, quietly and precisely, without requiring her to raise her voice or explain herself. She had been maneuvered. "Is it enough?" she asked. Earring. William was quiet for a moment. "It depends on what the opposing counsel brings. You think they'll bring something?" Nathaniel felt the ground shift last week," William said. "And I think he's not the kind of man who lets ground shift without trying to correct it." He was right. They found out how right 2 days later. The letter arrived at William's solicitor's office on Thursday morning. Official. Properly filed, submitted by the opposing counsel in the custody matter, which was, and Elizabeth felt the cold drop of it when William read it to her, the Caldwell family's legal firm. The Caldwells had an interest in the custody case. Directly, not transparently, but they had submitted a formal character brief on behalf of a coalition of concerned community members, 5 names, all respectable, all with some connection to Charleston society, expressing reservations about the fitness of the proposed household environment for a child of Clara's age and circumstances. The brief named Elizabeth specifically. It referenced her history with Nathaniel Caldwell. It referenced the events of the governor's assembly. It referenced, with careful, precise, technically accurate language, several things that were absolutely true: that Elizabeth had been involved in the mismanagement of her father's estate, that there had been questions about her emotional stability during that period, that her sudden reappearance in public life and equally sudden engagement to a prominent man currently involved in a contested custody matter raised concerns about her intentions and judgment. Every single word of it was technically accurate, and it built, and by line, a portrait that was completely, devastatingly false. Elizabeth read it herself, handed it to her and said nothing, and let her read it, which was the right decision, because she needed to read it alone, without anyone watching her face. She read it twice, then she set it down on the desk. "Good," she said. Her voice was flat, not with the flatness of someone trying to hide how they felt, with the flatness of someone who has moved past feeling into something more functional. She had visited this place before, in the first weeks after Nathaniel had left the space beyond grief where you simply assessed the situation. "He's very good," she said again. "Every word of this is defensible. A court could read this and find nothing objectionable in it." "Yes," William said. "And a court could read this and come to exactly the conclusion he wants them to come to." "Yes." She looked up. "Then we need to do something he won't expect." William looked at her. "He expects me to deny it," she said. "That's what I've been doing for 3 years. Denying it, defending myself, trying to correct the record from the outside." She stood up. "He knows how to respond to that. He's been responding to that. He has a whole architecture built to receive and redirect anything I try to correct." "What are you suggesting?" William said. "I'm suggesting we stop correcting," Elizabeth said, "and start building." The man in Columbia was named Deacon Marsh. William had mentioned him several times, the property law specialist, the man who had found the dissolved firm connection. But Elizabeth had not met him. She met him on Saturday 2 weeks and 1 day before the hearing. He arrived at William's house mid-morning, a lean man of about 50 with the deeply practical air of someone who had spent his career inside documents and had come to find documents more honest than most people. He shook William's hand, nodded at Elizabeth, and sat down at the desk. "Next through all of it," I said, without preamble. He set his own satchel on the desk. "The deed transfers, the assessment firm, the payment records, the witness signatures." Looked at Elizabeth directly. "Robbed, Miss Whitmore." It was the first time anyone had used that word. Not defrauded, not deceived, not mismanaged. Robbed. Elizabeth felt it in her sternum like a struck note. "We prove it," she said. Marsh looked at William. Then back at her. "We can prove enough of it that a court would be obligated to ask hard questions." He opened his satchel and began placing documents on the desk, his own copies, annotated in his small, precise handwriting. "A dissolved firm connection is the thread. Nay, we pull that, we can demonstrate that at least 3 of the property transfers from your father's estate in the period of 1815 and 1816 were facilitated through what amounts to a shell arrangement money, moving through a non-functioning entity, ending up in accounts connected to the Caldwell family's business interests." "That's fraud," William said. "That's fraud," Marsh agreed. "The question is not whether it happened. The question is whether we can establish it clearly enough, quickly enough, for a court that has also just received a character brief from the Caldwell family's own legal firm." Elizabeth looked at the documents spread across the desk. 3 years of paper. 3 years of a story she had not been able to make legible, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because she'd been trying to read it in the wrong direction. She looked up at Marsh. "What do we need?" "We need the clerk," Marsh said. "Robert Cleary," William said. "The witness on the deed transfers," Marsh said. "He's the link between the Caldwell legal firm and the documents themselves. If he will testify, or even if we can establish through records that he was employed by Caldwell's firm at the time, that weakens the claim that these transfers were independent, unbiased transactions." "Where is he now?" Elizabeth asked. Marsh and William exchanged a look. Still in Columbia, Marsh said. Still in law. He left the Caldwell firm in 1817. We don't know under what circumstances. He's with a smaller firm now. Wills and estate work, mostly. He left in 1817, Elizabeth said slowly, 1 year after the last of the transfers. Yes, Marsh said. That's interesting, she said. It's very interesting, Marsh agreed. There was a sound from the doorway. Clara was standing there in her afternoon dress, holding not a book today, but the small china horse she kept on her windowsill. She brought it downstairs sometimes. Elizabeth had noticed, when something was making her anxious. She held it in both hands and looked between the three adults with her measuring, too-old expression. Is it about the hearing? Clara said. William said, Clara. I know it's about the hearing, Clara said, not challenging. Just stating. I know there are people who don't think you should keep me. She looked at her uncle with the directness that was, Elizabeth had come to understand, simply how Clara looked at things that mattered. Are you going to be able to fix it? The room was very still. William crossed to her. He crouched down so he was at her level, something Elizabeth had seen him do before, this specific gesture of making himself smaller, so Clara didn't have to look up to reach him, and he said, That's what we're working on. Miss Whitmore is helping? Clara, yes, William said. Clara looked at Elizabeth over her uncle's shoulder. Something moved through the child's face, not quite a smile, something quieter. The look of someone who has decided to trust a thing before it has fully proven itself, because the evidence so far has been sufficient. Okay, Clara said. She went back upstairs. Marsh watched the doorway for a moment after she was gone. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, let's make sure we deserve that. They worked through the afternoon. Marsh laid out the strategy carefully, in the Veld. The next unemotional way of a man who treated legal problems as problems to be solved, rather than battles to be won, which Elizabeth found, paradoxically, more reassuring than any dramatic declaration would have been. Case for William's fitness as Clara's guardian was, on its merits, strong. It had always been strong. He had the resources, the property, the character references, the practical arrangements in place. The opposing brief from the Caldwell firm was not about William's fitness in any genuine sense. It was about creating noise, introducing doubt, making the picture complicated enough that a court might hesitate. Counter it, they needed to do two things simultaneously. The first was to address Elizabeth's position directly, not defensively, not with denials, but with documentation. The same documents that told the story of what Nathaniel had done to her father's estate were also the documents that told the story of what had been done to her reputation. A woman who had been systematically deceived was not the same as a woman who had been unstable. Paper trail, once properly assembled, said so. Was Robert Cleary. Can we reach him? Elizabeth asked. Marsh tapped his fingers against the desk. We can try. The question is whether he has anything to gain from speaking and whether he has something to lose from the Caldwells finding out he did. Already left their firm, William said. Leaving and testifying against them are different things, Marsh said. Men leave jobs for all kinds of reasons. Men testify against former employers for fewer of them. What Elizabeth said. Marsh looked at her. Depends on why he left, he said. If he left because of something related to the transfers, if he saw what was happening and found it uncomfortable enough to distance himself, then perhaps it would not take very much at all. Anne. Sometimes people are waiting for someone to ask the right question. And if he left for reasons unrelated, William said. Then it becomes considerably more complicated, Marsh said. He would be taking a risk for people he doesn't know, about events he participated in a role that could be characterized as complicit. He was a clerk, Elizabeth said. He was a witness, Marsh said. The distinction matters legally, but human beings do not always reason legally about their own conduct. They sat with that for a moment. Then Elizabeth said, Let me write the letter. Both men looked at her. Not a legal letter, she said. Not from the firm, not official. Let me write it. She met William's eyes. You said it yourself, sometimes people are waiting for someone to ask the right question. Right letter, from the right person. She paused. I am very good at telling the truth. Let me tell it to him. Another silence. Then William said, all right. Marsh said, don't promise anything we can't deliver. Never do, Elizabeth said. She wrote the letter that evening, at the desk in Margaret's sitting room, with Margaret asleep upstairs and the house quiet around her. Wrote 3 drafts. Before she had one she was satisfied with. She did not accuse. She did not demand. She stated the facts, plainly and precisely. From the beginning, her father's illness, the documents, the transfers, the firm that had ceased to exist, before the payment that had passed through it. She stated that she had recently become aware, through property records, that Mr. Robert Cleary had served as witness on 2 of those transfers while employed at the Caldwell family's legal firm. She stated that she was not accusing him of wrongdoing. She stated that she believed, from the timing of his departure from that firm, that he might have some knowledge of the circumstances that would be valuable to the truth. And then she wrote, I have spent 3 years watching a carefully constructed story about me pass through this society as fact. I understand what it is to know the truth about something and find yourself without the means to say it. If you have information that would allow the truth to be told in full, I am asking you, plainly, to tell it. Not for me, for the record of what actually happened. She sealed it. She sent it with Marsh's courier the following morning. Then she went to William's house and sat across from Clara at the breakfast table and helped her with the arithmetical problem that had been assigned by her tutor and didn't talk about any of it. Clara solved the problem. She was good at it, quick and precise, the same quality in her thinking that showed up in the way she watched people. You're worried, Clara said, not looking up from the paper. A little, Elizabeth said. About the hearing? About a letter I sent, Elizabeth said. Looked up. A letter to who? Someone I need something from, Elizabeth said. Someone who may not be willing to give it. Clara considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. What did you say in the letter? The truth, Elizabeth said. And a request. Then you did what you could do, Clara said simply, and looked back at her arithmetic. Elizabeth looked at the top of the child's bent head and felt, very suddenly, and rather inconveniently, that her eyes were stinging. She controlled it. She had 3 years of practice at controlling it. She said, You're very wise for 9. I'm almost 10, Clara said. And Uncle William says wisdom isn't about age, it's about paying attention. Uncle William, Elizabeth said, is occasionally correct about things. Almost smiled. She had her uncle's way with almost smiling the expression that arrived and then retreated before it fully formed, as though the person had said the feeling was real, but the showing of it required a little more cause. Elizabeth was beginning to find it one of the most genuine things she had ever seen on a human face. The reply from Robert Cleary arrived on Tuesday, 4 days before the hearing. It was short. 2 pages. William's courier had brought it directly from Marsh's office, and William had sent for Elizabeth immediately, and she was in the study in 40 minutes, still catching her breath from the speed of the carriage. She read it. She read it again. Then she set it down on the desk and said nothing for a moment, because she needed a moment. Cleary had not denied anything. He had not confirmed everything. But what he had written in the careful, precise language of a man who had spent years working with legal documents and understood exactly what his words would mean was this: that he had been troubled by certain aspects of the transfers at the time. That he had raised a concern informally, privately, with a senior partner at the Caldwell firm, regarding the relationship between the dissolved assessment firm and the Caldwell family's business interests. He had been told, clearly, that his concern was noted and that his continued employment at the firm would benefit from his not raising it again. That he had left the firm 4 months later, citing personal reasons, which was what one cited when the real reasons were not the kind that could be cited. And that he was willing to appear before the court. Elizabeth put both hands flat on the desk. She did not cry. She was not going to cry. He's willing to testify, she said. William said. He knew, she said. He saw it and he knew what it was and they saw. Yes, and he left anyway, she looked up. He could have stayed. He could have kept his head down and kept the salary and told himself it wasn't his business. He could have, William said, but he left. She heard her own voice, not quite steady, not quite unsteady. Somewhere between the two. That was him trying to do the right thing with the only tool he had at the time. Looked at her. Yes, he said. I think so. She sat down. The chair caught her in the way that chairs do when you sit down suddenly, and without entirely meaning to. 4 days before the hearing. She had been waiting 3 years for the shape of what had happened to her to become visible to someone besides herself. 80. She had been waiting 3 years for the story to be correctable. For the evidence to be assembled in a room by people who could make it mean something. And here it was, not everything. Not a complete and perfect reversal of 3 years of damage. A thread pulled clear, a chain of names. A man willing to stand up in a courtroom and say that he had seen something wrong and had been told to stay quiet about it. It was enough. It was not going to be painless. Nothing that happened in the next 4 days was going to be painless. She understood that absolutely. Nathaniel would fight it. The Caldwell firm would produce their counter. The courtroom was not going to be the clean, dramatic vindication that stories promised. It was going to be difficult and contested, and she was going to have to sit in a room while people characterized her with technically accurate language designed to diminish her, and she was going to have to remain composed through all of it. But the truth was going to be in that room, and the truth was going to have a voice that was not just hers. That was different from anything she had had for 3 years. William came around the desk and sat in the other chair, not across from her, beside her, and they sat there for a moment together, looking at the letter. We have 4 days, he said. 4 days, she agreed. Marsh needs to prepare Cleary, file the response to the opposing brief, submit the documentary evidence in proper form. He went through it methodically, practically, the way he did everything. And you will need to speak with your own solicitor. Purvis is in Georgia now, but his written account of the estate management during that period could be relevant. I'll write to him tonight, Elizabeth said, and he stopped. And? He was quiet for a moment. William Harrington being quiet had a particular texture to it, not hesitation, not avoidance. The quiet of someone choosing their words because the words mattered. And whatever happens in that room, he said, whatever they say about you in the course of this, and they will say things, Elizabeth. Because that is what opposing counsel does, and you know that. And you are going to have to hear it in public. He stopped. You have told the truth. You have the evidence. And whatever the court decides about anything else, the record is going to say something different about you than it has said for 3 years. She looked at him. She had not, in the weeks since the governor's assembly, spent a great deal of time thinking about William Harrington as a person separate from the arrangement. She had thought about him as a practical partner, as someone whose judgment she was coming to trust. As the man who had looked at 3 years of paper and found the thread she had missed. But she had not thought deliberately, carefully not thought about what it meant that he had done any of that. About what it revealed about the kind of man he was. About what it meant that he had listened to her in that assembly room for 2 hours and then said, not because it benefited him but because it was true, I did not say I had formed an opinion. She thought about it now. Thank you, she said. It was not sufficient. She knew it wasn't sufficient, but there was not a word in the language she spoke for what she was actually trying to for the specific, particular gratitude of someone who has been given back the right to tell their own story. William looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly and without any decoration at all, "Don't thank me yet. We still have 4 days." But his voice had that thing in it again, the thing she had heard the day she arrived with the satchel, the day he had found the dissolved firm connection. Clara had stood in the doorway holding her china horse and asked if they were going to be able to fix it. A thing that was not quite warmth and not quite certainty but was built, she was beginning to understand, from both, She stood up. She straightened her dress. She picked up her reticule. Days, she said. She left to write letters. And, in the room behind her, me. William Harrington looked at the letter from Robert Cleary, and at the documents spread across his desk, and at the chair Elizabeth had just vacated, and he allowed himself, privately, feel something he had been very carefully not feeling for the better part of 3 weeks. Something that had nothing to do with the arrangement. Something that had everything to do with a woman who had walked across a ballroom and grabbed a stranger because she had 4 seconds and nothing left to lose, and who had, in the weeks since, shown him what it looked like when a person refused, absolutely and without exception, to be reduced to the story someone else had decided to tell about them. Later, he went back to work. 4 days. The morning of the hearing arrived the way hard mornings always do, without ceremony, without warning, as though it were simply another day, and the world had not noticed that everything was about to be decided. Elizabeth was awake before dawn. She had not slept well. She had not expected to. She had lain in the dark at Margaret's house and gone through the documents in her head, not anxiously, not the circular, exhausting way. She had spent 3 years going through them, but methodically, the way Marsh had taught her to in the days of preparation. Fact by fact, name by name, the chain of it, clean and clear, assembled at last into something that told the truth. She dressed without Margaret's help, which Margaret would have objected to if she had been awake, which she was not. Margaret slept with the deep, uncomplicated conviction of a woman who had decided the night before that worrying further would accomplish nothing, and had acted on that decision. Elizabeth had always found this quality in her cousin both admirable and faintly baffling. She was at William's house at 7:30. Mrs. Aldridge opened the door without a word, which was Mrs. Aldridge's way of communicating that she had been expecting her and found nothing surprising about the hour. She took Elizabeth's shawl. She said that Mr. Harrington was in the study and that breakfast was on the sideboard and that Clara had already been fed and was upstairs with her tutor, who had been specifically asked to keep her occupied until noon. Elizabeth nodded. She went to the study. William was at his desk. He had clearly been there for some time. The lamp was lit, which meant he had been there before sunrise, and his collar was not yet fully arranged, which was the closest she had seen him come to looking unpolished. Looked up when she entered. "You didn't sleep," she said. Adequately, he said, which was not a yes. She sat down. "Is Marsh ready?" "He's been ready for 2 days. He'll meet us at the courthouse at 9. William set down the document he'd been reading and looked at her directly. "Cleary arrived in Charleston last night. Marsh met with him again this morning." He paused, choosing the word, determined. Nervous, but determined. "He's doing the right thing," Elizabeth said. "People are usually nervous when they do the right thing. It's the people who feel nothing who worry me." William looked at her for a moment. "How are you?" It was such a simple question that it surprised her. Nay, they had spent days talking about documents and strategy, and the legal mechanics of what was about to happen, and he was asking how she was with the directness of someone who actually wanted to know the answer. "I'm frightened," she said. It came out without the usual management applied to it. "Not of losing. I have been on the losing end of things for 3 years, and I know what it feels like, and I survived it. Nah. I'm frightened of being in that room while someone takes the truth of what happened to me and arranges it into something ugly, and having to sit still and let them." William was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You won't be sitting still. You'll be watching. And there is a difference." She looked at him. "Mere, you spent 3 years unable to see the whole picture," he said. "Today you will see it, all of it. Whatever they bring you will know exactly what it is and what it isn't. That is not the same as sitting still. That is knowing." She held that for a moment. "Yes," she said. "All right." "All right," he said. They went to the courthouse. The courthouse in Charleston was a building that took itself seriously, in the way of buildings that had housed important decisions for a long time and had absorbed some of the weight of them. Elizabeth had been inside it exactly once before, years ago, for a property matter connected to her father's estate that had been resolved without drama. She had not expected to return. Marsh was waiting outside as promised with Cleary beside him. Elizabeth met Robert Cleary for the first time on the steps of the courthouse on the morning of the hearing. He was a quiet man, 8', 50-ish, with the careful, self-contained manner of someone who had spent years making himself unobtrusive in rooms where important men made important decisions. He looked at Elizabeth the way people look at someone they have agreed to help and are now confronting the reality of helping with a mixture of resolve and something that might have been apology. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Cleary," she said, "thank you for coming." He looked away briefly, then back. "I should have come forward a long time ago," he said. It was the kind of plain, undecorated statement that costs more than it sounds. "You came forward now," Elizabeth said. "That's what matters today." He went inside. The hearing room was not a full courtroom. This was a guardianship proceeding, presided over by Judge Aldous Fairfield, a man of 60 who had been on the bench for 20 years and had the reputation of someone who cared considerably more about facts than about the social standing of the people delivering them. Marsh had said this was good. Elizabeth was choosing to believe him. The room held perhaps 30 people, more than Elizabeth had expected. Word had traveled, had always traveled in Charleston, and there were faces she recognized from the governor's assembly, from years of social events before that, from the careful geography of a city that paid attention to its own business and everyone else's. Nathaniel Caldwell was seated on the opposing side of the room with his father's legal firm's representative, a man named Graves who had the broad, settled look of someone used to winning. Nathaniel himself was dressed impeccably, as always. He glanced at Elizabeth when she entered. She looked back at him. 3 years ago, that glance would have cost her something. The stomach drop of it, the involuntary flicent of someone who has been hurt by a person and hasn't finished healing. She had expected to feel it today. She had prepared herself for it. Almost nothing, not nothing exactly, a cold, specific recognition. The way you recognize a type of weather. She sat down beside William, who had positioned himself at the table with the particular, composed steadiness that was she understood now, after weeks of watching him, not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. He was feeling things. He simply didn't allow them to run loose in rooms where they couldn't do anything useful. Yeah, she was learning from that. Judge Fairfield entered at 9 o'clock precisely, reviewed the papers before him for approximately 90 seconds, and said, "Nay." Without looking up, "We are here on the matter of guardianship for the minor child Clara Harrington." "If counsel for the petitioner will proceed." Marsh stood. He was not a dramatic speaker. He did not perform. He presented the case for William's guardianship with the same methodical, act-forward approach he had used in every conversation Elizabeth had witnessed. "This is the situation. These are the facts. Here is what the facts mean." William's resources, his property, his established household. His relationship with Clara, documented over 14 months of care. The character letters from 3 prominent members of Charleston and Beaufort society, including, and Marsh let this land without emphasis, a personal letter from Mrs. Henry Beaumont, whose name moved through the room like a quiet stone dropped in water. When Marsh sat down, the representative from the Caldwell firm Graves stood. He was good. Elizabeth had known he would be. He was the kind of good that was built on long practice and considerable confidence, the particular fluency of a man who had spent years shaping facts into the story he needed them to tell. He presented the opposing brief smoothly. The concerns about the household environment. The questions about stability and fitness. He introduced Elizabeth, carefully not attacking her directly, nothing so obvious but building a picture, piece by piece, of a household that had introduced an element of uncertainty, of social complexity, of contested history. Every word was chosen, every word was defensible. Elizabeth listened. She kept her face composed. She kept her hands flat on the table in front of her. Beside her, she could feel William doing the same. Then Graves said, "And we would submit that the recent and sudden nature of the engagement between Mr. Harrington and Miss Whitmore, a woman whose own conduct of affairs has been a matter of public concern in this community, raises legitimate questions about the judgment being applied to decisions affecting this child's welfare." Room shifted, not dramatically, but it shifted. Fairfield looked up from his papers. "Counsel," he said. "Yeah. Are you submitting a character challenge regarding Miss Whitmore, or are you questioning the petitioner's judgment in forming this association?" "Honor," Graves said smoothly. "They are not separable." "Then you had better have something more substantial than public concern," Fairfield said. Proceed. Graves produced his witnesses, 2 of them. Respectable, both connected in ways that were not stated but were traceable, if you knew where to look, to the Caldwell family's social orbit. They spoke carefully about their observations, their concerns, their knowledge of the situation, all technically true, all arranged to build the specific picture Nathaniel needed the court to see. Elizabeth listened to both of them and thought, "This is what it sounds like. This is the sound of what he did, performed in public, for a room to hear." She had heard versions of it for 3 years. She had never heard it so clearly before, because she had never before been sitting in a room with the full truth of the thing assembled and ready. She thought, "You are not going to win this." Marsh cross-examined both witnesses with surgical brevity. He did not try to discredit them wholesale. There was nothing to discredit. They had said nothing technically false. He simply asked questions that introduced space around their testimony, and questions about what they had personally observed versus what they had been told. Questions about how they had come to be in contact with a Caldwell family's legal firm. Questions that were themselves technically neutral and were devastating in their implications. Twice. Fairfield overruled him twice. Then Marsh said, "Honor, the petitioner would like to introduce documentary evidence regarding the history of Miss Whitmore's involvement with the Whitmore estate, which the opposing brief has characterized in a manner that the petitioner submits is materially incomplete." Graves was on his feet before Marsh finished the sentence. Objection. The financial history of Miss Whitmore's family estate is not relevant to a guardianship proceeding. Opposing. Brief made it relevant, Fairfield said, when they introduced it as a character question. "Open that door, Mr. Graves, I'll allow it." "Proceed, Mr. Marsh." Elizabeth felt the room shift again, began to lay out the documents. He did it slowly, deliberate, narrating each piece as he submitted it, not rushing, not dramatizing, simply building the chain, link by link, in the precise order that made it legible. The dissolved assessment firm, the payment record, the county deed transfers, the witness signatures, the business registry showing the firm's dissolution date 1 month before the payment made in its name. Graves was very still. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel. He was looking at the documents on the judge's table. His expression was controlled. His face showed nothing. But his right hand, resting on the table beside him, had tightened. She could see it from across the room, the slight, specific stiffening of a man watching something he had believed was buried being laid out in daylight. She had not expected to feel satisfaction at it. She had not expected to feel much of anything in this moment, except the cold, focused attention of getting through it. Felt it small, specific, entirely justified. "Honor," Marsh said. "The petitioner submits that the characterization of Miss Whitmore's conduct of her father's estate as evidence of personal instability is not supported by the full documentary record. The full record suggests instead that Miss Whitmore was the subject of a series of transactions conducted through what appears to have been a deliberately obscured arrangement involving parties with connections to interests adverse to the Whitmore estate." Paused, let it land, and the petitioner calls Robert Cleary. The sound that moved through the room was not quite audible. It was more like a collective involuntary change in the quality of the air. Elizabeth felt it against her skin. Graves was on his feet again. Honor, this witness was not disclosed in the original. He was disclosed in the amended submission filed 2 days ago, Marsh said, which opposing counsel received and acknowledged. Airfield looked at Graves. Did you? A pause that lasted precisely 1 second too long. Yes, Your Honor. Then sit down, Fairfield said. Call your witness, Mr. Marsh. Robert Cleary walked to the front of the room. He was more composed than Elizabeth had expected. The nervousness she had seen on the courthouse steps had not disappeared. It was still there, in the set of his jaw, in the deliberate way he placed each step, but he carried it differently now. The way a man carries something when he has decided the carrying is necessary, regardless of the weight. He was sworn. Urch led him through it carefully, the same way he led through everything fact by fact, and, without embellishment, letting the plain shape of it do the work that drama would have overdone. Cleary had been a clerk at the Caldwell legal firm from 1813 to 1817. He had served as witness on the 2 Whitmore estate deed transfers in 1815 and 1816. He had, at the time of witnessing, been aware of the relationship between the dissolved assessment firm named in the payment record and a business partner of the senior Caldwell. He had raised this concern informally with a partner at the firm. And what was the response to that concern? Marsh said. Cleary was quiet for 1 moment. Then, I was told that my continued employment at the firm would benefit from my not raising it further. The room was absolutely still. And did you raise it further? Marsh said. No, Cleary said. I left the firm 4 months later. Marsh said no further questions. Graves stood for cross-examination. He was still composed. He had the composure of a man who had not gotten where he was by losing it when things became difficult. He approached Cleary with the measured confidence of someone who still believed there was something to work with. Mr. Cleary, he said, you say you raised a concern. This concern, it was informal, you said. No written record. No written record, Cleary said. No formal complaint filed with any regulatory body? No. And you left the firm citing personal reasons, you said. Not professional ones, yes. So what you're asking this court to believe, Graves said, with the smooth precision of someone landing a prepared point, that you witnessed irregularities, serious enough to disturb you, and your response was nothing. You did nothing. You simply left. Cleary looked at him. There was something in his expression that Elizabeth recognized the look of someone who has already reckoned with the most painful version of the question and is not going to be surprised by a softer one. Cleary said, I did nothing. I'm doing something now. Graves paused, just for a half second. Then, 4 years later, at the request of parties with an interest in this proceeding. At the request of a woman who was robbed, Cleary said. The word landed in the room the same way it had landed in Elizabeth, when Marsh first said it like a struck bell. Clean and resonant and impossible to unhear. Graves recovered. Allegedly, I witnessed the documents, Cleary said. I was there. I know what I saw. I did not have the courage to say it at the time, and I have to live with that. But I am saying it now. Graves looked at him for a moment. Nah, he sat down, in. The pause that followed, Elizabeth heard the quality of the room around her. Change one more time, not dramatically, not with any single identifiable sound. In the way that a room changes when the weight of shifted from one side to the other, and everyone present can feel it, even if no one has yet said so. Airfield looked at the documents on his table. He looked at Marsh. Looked at Graves. He looked briefly at Nathaniel Caldwell, who was looking at nothing in particular with the controlled expression of a man who had made his peace with a situation or was doing an excellent imitation of it. I'm going to take a brief recess, Fairfield said. The room, Elizabeth breathed. William's hand was on the table beside hers. He did not take her hand, it was a public room, and neither of them was given to gestures that would have required explanation. But his hand was there, 3 inches from hers, and she was aware of it, with a specificity that had nothing to do with the arrangement, and everything to do with the past 3 weeks of sitting across from this man in quiet rooms while the truth was being assembled. "You're all right," William said quietly. "I know," she said. "Whatever he decides, I know," she said again. She meant it. She had meant what she said that morning. She had been losing for 3 years, and she knew how to survive it. But she had not been in a room with this much truth in it for 3 years. Whatever happened next, that was real. That was not going away. Fairfield came back after 12 minutes. He sat. He arranged his papers with the unhurried attention of a man who was going to say what he was going to say, regardless of the temperature in the room around him. In the matter of guardianship for Clara Harrington, he said, "This court finds the petitioner, Annan, William Harrington, be a fit and appropriate guardian." Opposing brief submitted concerns about household stability and character that this court finds to be insufficiently substantiated relative to the petitioner's documented capacity to provide appropriate care. He paused. A. The questions raised about Miss Whitmore's conduct of her father's estate introduced by opposing counsel as a character matter have been substantially complicated by the documentary evidence submitted this morning. This court makes no final ruling on those specific property matters, as they are not the subject of this proceeding, but notes for the record that the characterization offered in the opposing brief appears to be materially incomplete. He looked up. Guardianship is awarded to William Harrington. This matter is concluded. He stood. The room stood with him. And then he was gone, and the sound of the room returned all at once, a collective exhale of 30 people, releasing the breath they had all been holding for the past 2 hours. And William's hand moved the 3 inches and covered hers on the table, briefly and completely, and then withdrew. Nair. She looked at him. He was looking at the papers in front of him, his expression controlled as always. The line of his jaw was different. She knew this face well enough now to see it. The specific quality of relief in a man who does not permit himself many open expressions of feeling. "William," she said. He looked up. "Claire is yours," she said. He did not say anything, but his eye, for one unguarded moment, everything he had been carrying for 14 months, the fear of it, the weight of the promise he had made to his dying sister, relentless. Practical forward motion of a man who had not allowed himself to feel the full dimension of the threat until it was resolved. "Yes," he said quietly, "she is." They filed out of the courthouse into the summer heat. Marsh was talking something about next steps, about the property matter being a separate proceeding, about the options available to Elizabeth, given what had been entered into the record today, about Robert Cleary and what he was prepared to do further if the property case was pursued. Elizabeth heard it at a slight remove, the way you hear things, when something important has just finished and your mind has not entirely accepted that it can stand down. She was aware of Nathaniel somewhere to her left. She did not look at him. She did not need to. He was not today the man she needed to look at. What she needed, and this surprised her, the specific practical shape of the need, was to get to William's house. To sit in the study with Clara, who did not know yet that the hearing was over, who had been sitting with her tutor since morning, learning her arithmetical tables, and wondering, in the quiet, what self-contained way she wondered things, how it had gone. Wanted to be the one to tell her. "I need to get to Clara," she said. Marsh paused mid-sentence. William looked at her. "Go," William said. "Carriage, take it. I'll walk with Marsh. Go." She went. The carriage took 7 minutes. Elizabeth spent them in a state that was not quite any single feeling, not relief, not triumph, not the completion she had been imagining for 3 years. Something more composite than any of those. Something made of paper trails and courtrooms and 12 days of working beside a man who looked at documents until he found the truth in them. And a 9-year-old girl who had looked at her on a bench and decided on the available evidence to trust her. Mrs. Eldridge opened the door before Elizabeth had finished climbing the steps. "How did it go?" Mrs. Aldridge said, which was 3 words more than she usually offered, and therefore, from her, constituted near desperation. "He has her," Elizabeth said. "It's done." Mrs. Aldridge's face did something complicated. For one brief moment, the permanent, measured composure of a woman who had managed complicated households for decades showed its underneath, and what was underneath was simply love. Uncomplicated, specifically directed love for a 9-year-old girl who had been in this house for 14 months and had become the kind of presence that a house organizes itself around. "She's in the parlor," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Tutor's gone." Elizabeth went to the parlor. Clara was sitting in the window chair with a book she was visibly not reading. She looked up when Elizabeth came in. Her eyes went immediately to Elizabeth's face reading it, the way she read everything, directly and completely, and without pretense. "It's good, isn't it?" Clara said. Not a question. "It's very good," Elizabeth said. Clara was quiet for exactly one moment. Then she set the book down. She stood up. She crossed the room, and she put her arms around Elizabeth's waist, and she held on. She did not cry. Clara was not apparently a crier. She held on with the specific concentrated grip of someone who has been trying not to need anything for a very long time and has finally decided that needing this particular thing is acceptable. Elizabeth held her back. She did not cry either. She was not going to cry in front of Clara. She almost did anyway. When Clara stepped back, her expression was the same as always, composed, slightly serious, measuring. But there was something in it that had not been there before. Lighter, as though one specific particular worry had been set down, and the face had not yet adjusted to the absence of the weight. "Is Uncle William coming?" Clara asked. "He'll be here soon," Elizabeth said. "Are you staying for supper?" Elizabeth looked at her. "Mrs. Aldridge makes very good chicken on Thursdays," Clara said. "She started doing it because I told her it was my favorite, and now she does it every Thursday." She paused. "I think you should stay." It was, Elizabeth would think later, the most ordinary sentence she had heard in months. Most ordinary, and somehow the most complete. "I think I should too," Elizabeth said. "Yeah." And somewhere across the city, in whatever room he occupied when a thing he had built out of careful deception met the version of events that turned out to be stronger, Nathaniel Caldwell was beginning to understand that the record had been corrected. Entirely, not in every way it could be, but enough. And, in the courthouse record, entered in the dry, ain't formal language of legal proceedings that would sit in the files of Charleston County, for as long as the building stood, notation. The characterization offered in the opposing brief appears to be materially incomplete. It was not the complete restoration she had needed. But it was the truth written down, in a place it could not be undone. It was a beginning, and she was staying for supper. Chicken was very good. Clara had been right about that, as she was right about most things she bothered to have opinions on. Aldridge set the table without being asked, as though the question of whether Elizabeth was staying had never been in doubt, and the three of them ate together, in the particular. Comfortable quiet of people who have been through something large and are now sitting on the other side of it, still learning the shape of the relief. William arrived 40 minutes after Elizabeth. He came through the front door and went directly to Clara, who had heard him in the hallway and met him halfway, and he put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her face for a moment, without saying anything. The way people look at things they were afraid of losing and didn't. Era said, "Mrs. Aldridge made chicken." William said, "I know." He could smell it from the street. And that was how that was handled. They ate. They talked about Clara's arithmetic. She had advanced to a new problem set and had opinions about the methodology her tutor was using, which she delivered with the precise, unsentimental confidence of someone who had examined the evidence and reached a conclusion. Listened. Elizabeth listened. The hearing was not discussed at the table. It did not need to be. It sat with them like a fourth presence, quiet and settled, belonging to all three of them in different ways. Afterward, Clara went upstairs. Mrs. Aldridge cleared the table. And Elizabeth and William were left in the sitting room, with the summer evening coming through the windows and no particular agenda for the first time in 3 weeks. It was strange, Elizabeth found, the absence of urgency. She had become so accustomed to the forward press of it, documents to review, letters to write, strategy to refine, the hearing approaching like a fixed point that organized everything around itself, that the space left behind felt unfamiliar. Not unpleasant, just new. You should know, William said, that Marsh intends to file a separate proceeding. Regarding the property matter, Elizabeth looked at him. The estate, the transfers, the dissolved firm. Cleary's testimony combined with what we submitted today is sufficient to open a formal inquiry. He paused. It won't be fast. These things rarely are, and it won't be painless. I know, Elizabeth said. You'll have to sit in rooms and hear things said about you again, he said. More formally than today. With opposing counsel who will be considerably less restrained, because this time it will be the Caldwell family's direct interests at stake, not a guardianship proceeding they were adjacent to. I know, she said again, and the outcome is not certain. William, she said it quietly, I know all of this. I have known it since the moment Marsh said we had enough to open a case. She met his eyes. I am not afraid of uncertain outcomes. I have been living inside an uncertain outcome for 3 years. At least this time the uncertainty goes in both directions. He looked at her. Before, she said, there was only one possible ending. The story Nathaniel told was the only one being told. Now there are two. She held his gaze. That is entirely different from where I was. William was quiet for a moment. Then you're going to fight it. Yeah, of course I'm going to fight it, she said. Something moved through his expression, brief, specific, the thing she had learned to recognize in him as genuine feeling surfacing before he had time to arrange it. He looked away first, which was unusual. William Harrington was not a man who looked away first. The 6 months ends in 3 weeks, he said. The sentence landed in the room with a weight she had not entirely prepared for. She had known it was coming. She had known since the night of the governor's assembly, since she had shaken his hand in the middle of the music and the lantern light and said 6 months with the practical clarity of someone establishing a business arrangement. She had known it the way she knew all the things she had carefully not thought too directly about the way you know where a bruise is by how carefully you move around it. She said, the hearing is concluded, Clara is protected. He said it evenly. Methodically. The original terms of the arrangement have been satisfied. She said again, you are under no obligation to, he stopped. Elizabeth waited. He stopped in the specific way of a man who has said the logical sentence and found it inadequate and does not know yet what the adequate one is. She had spent 3 weeks watching this man find words for things. He was careful with language not because he was evasive, but because he believed words should mean what they said, and he was unwilling to say something that didn't mean what he needed it to mean. She had come to find this quality in him rather extraordinary. She had also come to find that watching him work his way toward the real sentence was one of the more quietly riveting experiences she had had in recent memory. You are under no obligation, yet again, starting differently this time, continue an arrangement that was designed for a specific purpose that has now been served. No, she agreed, I'm not, and I would not. I have never wanted you to feel that anything I have done in the past 3 weeks creates an obligation of any kind, toward me or toward Clara. He said it with a particular careful deliberateness. What we did was a fair exchange. You gave me the credibility the hearing required. I gave you the platform the documentary evidence required. We both gained from it. That does not create a debt. Elizabeth looked at him. She thought about what he had just said, and she thought about the man who had said it, a man who had spent 3 weeks going through her father's documents before sunrise, who had contacted people in Colombia, had found the thread she had missed for 3 years, who had sat beside her in a courthouse and put his hand over hers for exactly 3 seconds before taking it back. A man who was now, with great care and evident difficulty, making sure she knew she was free to leave. She said, yes. Are you trying to release me from the arrangement, or are you trying to give me the opportunity to release myself, because you believe I might want to and haven't found the opening? He was quiet for a moment. The second one, he said. And if I don't want to? The silence that followed had a different quality than all the other silences in the room. Heavier. More specifically waited, the kind of silence that knows it matters. And I would need you to say so plainly, he said. Because I have been, he stopped, a breath. I have been very careful not to assume anything about what this has been for you, about what the past 3 weeks have meant or not meant. And I need you to understand that whatever you tell me, it will not alter the property case, or the hearing outcome, or my regard for you. None of that is conditional on William. He stopped. I don't want to leave, she said, simply, without decoration. Yeah. I did not want to leave approximately 2 weeks ago, and I have been very carefully not thinking about that because the hearing required thinking about other things, and I was not going to introduce a complication at the worst possible moment. She kept her eyes on his. A hearing is over. I am thinking about it now. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, 2 weeks ago. At minimum, she said. Another silence. This one had a different texture, entirely lighter almost, except that it was also somehow heavier. The particular feeling of something that has been held in careful suspension, finally finding its center of gravity. I am not easy to live with, William said. I say this not as self-deprecation but as fact. I am methodical to a degree that most people find tedious. I have opinions about how documents should be organized. Keep irregular hours. I have a 9-year-old child who reads ghost stories and interrogates the epistemological foundations of arithmetic. I know, Elizabeth said. I have been in your house every day for 3 weeks. And I organized those documents with you, she said. And I kept the same irregular hours. And Clara and I have had 3 separate conversations about ghost stories, and I am currently reading the one she recommended to me, and I have not slept properly for 2 nights because of it. She tilted her head slightly. What is the point you are making? The point I am making, Nan, William said, and his voice had changed, lost the careful, managed quality. Become something more direct than she had heard from him. Outside of the moments when the documents were on the table, and he was simply telling her what the truth was is that if you stay, I would want you to stay knowing what you are staying in. Not the arrangement, not the 6-month agreement. The actual shape of it. I know the actual shape of it, she said. Then you also know that he stopped. Net it, that I would not be making this conversation easy to have unless I had a reason to make it difficult. The reason is that it matters, considerably. He met her eyes directly. Matter, considerably. Elizabeth held that for a moment. 3 years of a story in which she did not matter. Nan. 3 years of being the cautionary detail in other people's accounts of what happened. 3 years of fighting to correct a record that kept resetting itself to the version someone else had written. And a man sitting across from her, managing his own considerable feelings with his characteristic, methodical care, telling her she mattered in the flattest, most precise, most completely genuine terms she had ever heard from anyone. I know, she said softly. You matter to me too. He did not say anything, but he reached across the distance between their chairs, not dramatic, no grand gesture, simply a reach, and took her hand the way he had almost taken it in the courthouse. Time. Without the 3-inch gap, without the public room restraint. He held it. She let him. They sat like that for some time in the quiet of the Thursday evening, while Mrs. Aldridge moved through the house, doing the things that houses require, and Clara sat upstairs, most certainly not sleeping, most certainly aware, in the specific way she was aware of everything. That something important was happening, 1 floor below her. The morning brought Margaret. Of course it did. Ed arrived at William's house at 8 o'clock. She had apparently been informed by some mechanism Elizabeth had not identified, which was simply how Margaret operated, and she was in the sitting room with Elizabeth inside 5 minutes, with the expression of someone who has approximately 40 things to say and is choosing the order carefully. You stayed the night, Margaret said. In the guest room, Elizabeth said. With Mrs. Aldridge in the house and Clara upstairs. Don't begin. I'm not beginning anything, Margaret said, with the dignity of a woman who was absolutely beginning something. I am simply noting, Margaret. You look different, Margaret said. Elizabeth paused. I beg your pardon? You look different than you have looked in 3 years. Margaret studied her with the directness of someone who has known her for a very long time and is not going to pretend not to notice things. You look like yourself. The version of yourself from before. She paused. The version that wasn't carrying something too heavy. Elizabeth did not say anything for a moment. It is not finished, she said. The property case, Marsh is filing a separate proceeding. It will take time. Nathaniel will fight it. I know, Margaret said. And it is not going to be simple, any of it. The arrangement, it isn't what we said it was anymore, and that means it becomes something that requires, she stopped. It becomes something real, which is considerably more complicated than an arrangement. I know that too, Margaret said. You don't have objections? Margaret looked at her. Lizzie, she said. I watched that man spend 3 weeks going through your father's documents before anyone else was awake. I watched him listen to you. I watched him build a case in a courtroom that gave you back your name, not entirely, not yet, but enough. She folded her hands. I have been waiting 3 years for someone to listen to you. I don't have objections. Elizabeth looked at her cousin, this woman who had patted her hand in the carriage on the night of the governor's assembly, and said 3 years is long enough, who had let Mrs. Adledwell through the door, and Mrs. Beaumont through the door, and had stood in hallways overhearing conversations she absolutely should not have overheard, who had done all of it out of the specific, stubborn, uncomplicated love of someone who had decided you were worth standing beside, and had not revisited the decision since. Thank you, Elizabeth said. Don't thank me, Margaret said. Buy me a very good hat at Christmas. She went home shortly after because Margaret was also a woman who knew when she had said the essential thing and when further presence was superfluous. The news about the property inquiry reached Charleston's social geography within the week, the way all news reached it quickly, imperfectly, with additions and subtractions that were not in the original. The version that circulated first was that William Harrington had uncovered evidence of financial fraud connected to the Whitmore estate. The second version added that the fraud involved the Caldwell family. The third version, by which point the story had passed through enough conversations to have acquired narrative shape, said that Elizabeth Whitmore had been building the case for 3 years and had finally found the evidence to prove it. That last version was not entirely accurate. But it was, Elizabeth thought when she heard it, considerably more accurate than the story that had circulated before it. Did not see Nathaniel again for 2 weeks. When she did, it was not by choice. He was leaving the offices of his father's legal firm on a Tuesday afternoon as she was passing on her way to Marsh's office, and they came within 20 feet of each other on the street before either of them had time to redirect. She stopped. There were people around them. It was midday on a commercial street, and the world was going about its business, with no interest in two people standing 20 feet apart with 3 years of history between them. Nathaniel looked at her. He had never in 3 years looked at her like this. He had looked at her with pity, with condescension, with the particular, performative patience of a man playing a role he had written himself. He had never looked at her the way he looked at her now, stripped of the role, without the performance, as just a man standing on a street facing something he had believed was safely managed and had discovered, through a sequence of events he had not planned for, was not. He looked it like himself, she realized, perhaps for the first time. She did not feel what she had braced herself to feel, through 3 years of imagining this moment. Not anger, not the hot, consuming kind she had carried in the beginning. Not the grief she had felt later, not the exhaustion of the years in the middle. She felt largely clear. Miss Whitmore, he said. His voice was careful, not apologetic. The voice of a man taking the measure of a situation. Mr. Caldwell, she said, a pause. I understand there is to be a formal inquiry, he said. There is, she said. My family's legal counsel, he began. Will be involved in it, she said. Yes, I expect so. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not the controlled social composure she was used to seeing. Something underneath it. Something that was possibly the closest he came to being honest when he hadn't planned to be. I did not think, he said carefully, that you would find the threat. She held his gaze. No, she said. I don't imagine you did. Elizabeth, don't, she said. Not loudly. Not harshly. Simply as a statement of fact. Whatever you were going to say, don't. I am not interested in a conversation where you tell me how things looked from your position or ask me to consider the circumstances. I have spent 3 years considering circumstances. I am finished considering yours. He was quiet. There is going to be an inquiry, she said. It will go where the evidence takes it. That is all I have to say. She walked past him. She kept her pace measured, and her back straight, and she did not look over her shoulder, because she did not need to. She was not running. She was simply going where she was going, which was forward, which was where she intended to continue going for the foreseeable future. She arrived at Marsh's office and spent 2 hours reviewing documents. She did not think about Nathaniel Caldwell again that afternoon. She had the strong sense that this would continue to be the case. Clara turned 10 in September. The birthday itself was a small thing. William had asked what she wanted, and Clara had said, in her considered specific way, that she wanted a new book, a proper supper with the people she liked, and no fuss. So they did exactly that. A book from a bookseller on King Street that Clara had mentioned 3 weeks prior and believed nobody had noticed her mentioning. A supper that Mrs. Aldridge managed with the precision of someone who had been planning it longer than anyone had officially asked her to. And no fuss, or as close to no fuss as 4 adults who cared about a child could manage on her birthday. Elizabeth was there. Margaret was there. Marsh had sent a gift, a set of maps of the South Carolina coastline, which Clara received with the expression of someone who had not expected to be understood and was recalibrating. After supper, after Clara had gone upstairs with her book, after Margaret had gone home and Mrs. Aldridge had restored the kitchen to its usual order, William and Elizabeth sat in the study in the easy, familiar quiet that had replaced the urgency that used to occupy the same space. She's happy, Elizabeth said. Yes, William said. Not the way she was before Anne died. That's not coming back, she knows that. She's not waiting for it. Elizabeth thought about it. At a different kind, a built one, knowing what it's made of. William looked at her. How do you know that? She told me, Elizabeth said. Last week. We were talking about something else entirely, and she said that she thinks happy and safe are different things, and she used to think she needed both at once. But actually you can have safe first and then build the happy inside it. She paused. She worked that out herself. She's 10, William said. As of today, Elizabeth agreed. He was quiet for a moment. She told me she thinks you should stay. Elizabeth looked at him. She told you this directly? Last Thursday. While we were reviewing her geography lesson. He said it with the slightly stunned expression of a man who still occasionally found his niece's directness surprising despite considerable exposure to it. She said, and I am quoting precisely, I think Miss Whitmore should stay. She tells the truth and she's good at arithmetic, and she doesn't pretend things are fine when they're not. Those are hard to find. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Those are hard to find, she repeated. Yes, she's not wrong. She rarely is, William said. He looked at her. Elizabeth. Something in the way he said her name, the specific weight of it. No, not formal. No, not careful. And simply her name in his voice made her look at him directly. The arrangement is over, he said. It has been over since the hearing. What we are doing now is not an arrangement. I don't know exactly what it is. I have not had much practice at naming things before I understand them fully, but I know it is not an arrangement. No, she agreed, it's not, and I would like he stopped. Came at it differently. I would like, if you are willing, to find out what it is. Without a 6-month term. Without specific conditions or mutual benefit provisions. He held her gaze. Me. Simply 2 people who have spent 3 weeks in the same rooms and appear to function well together, and have both, I think, come to find the other person rather. Another pause. Rather necessary. Elizabeth looked at him. She thought about a ballroom. Seconds. A decision made in the space between one breath and the next, out of desperation and nothing else, without any possible understanding of what it would become. She thought about a stranger who had asked calmly whether it worked. She thought about documents and dissolved firms and a courthouse and a child's arms around her waist and chicken on Thursdays, and a man who looked at the truth until it became legible. Rather necessary, she said. Yes, he said. That is a very William Harrington way of saying it. I am aware, he said. I can try again if you would prefer. No, she said. She was smiling. She did not try to stop it. No, I find I like it. It sounds like you. It sounds like something you mean. I mean it completely, he said. She reached across the distance between them, as he had reached across the distance between their chairs that evening 3 weeks ago, and she put her hand over his. Then yes, she said. Let's find out what it is. He turned his hand over beneath hers, held it. The inquiry into the Whitmore estate proceeded through the autumn. It was not fast. Marsh had warned her it would not be fast, and he had been accurate. There were filings and counter-filings and testimony, and the particular grinding forward motion of legal processes that are contested at every step by people with resources and reasons to contest them. It moved. Robert Cleary testified again formally in October. He was steadier the second time, not because the stakes were lower, but because he had already done it once and found that the doing of it was survivable. He sat in the room and he said what he had seen, plainly and precisely, and the Caldwell firm's counter-examination did not succeed in moving him from it. Mrs. Beaumont attended. She was not required to. She came because she said she had been quiet too long and she was 63 and intended to stop being quiet immediately. She sat in the front row of the gallery and she did not look away from anything that was said, and her presence in that room, the 40-year weight of her social authority, simply deployed as witness, was worth more than 10 character letters. In November, the county court issued a preliminary finding. The transfers of 3 parcels of the Whitmore estate in 1,815 and 1,816 had been conducted through arrangements that the court found insufficiently transparent. A formal investigation into the disposition of the funds was ordered. The Caldwell family's attorneys filed an immediate appeal. It was not a victory, not yet. It was the beginning of a victory, the slow, unglamorous, legally complicated beginning that would take longer than anyone wanted and would require more from Elizabeth than she had already given. She found, entirely prepared to give it. She had something she had not had 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, or 6 months ago, when she had climbed into a carriage to attend assembly she did not want to attend and ended up making the most reckless decision of her life. She had a room of people who had seen the truth and said so. She had a man sitting beside her in the court gallery who had read every document twice and found the thread. She had a 10-year-old girl at home who had said those are hard to find and had chosen, on the available evidence, to trust her. And she had her own name, not entirely restored, not yet, not completely. On the record, in a place it could not be undone. The winter came in slowly that year. It came into Charleston, not with the dramatic cold of the northern states, but with a gradual, gentle cooling, the long evenings drawing in. The particular quality of light in December that made everything feel quieter. On the evening of the preliminary finding, after the legal team had dispersed and Marsh had gone back to his office to begin the response to the appeal, Elizabeth and William walked home together through the cooling air. Not quickly. Not with the focused purposefulness of people who had somewhere urgently to be. The purposefulness of people who have been walking for a long time and have decided, together, that this particular stretch of road can be walked slowly. It isn't over, Elizabeth said. No, William agreed. Not for a while yet. They'll appeal everything they can appeal. Yes, and the process will be long and unpleasant at intervals. He said it with the calm of a man who had decided already that unpleasant at intervals was the cost of the thing he was committed to. And we will get through it. She looked at him sideways. We, he said without any equivocation whatsoever. She thought about that word, the size of it. Andy, specific, extraordinary ordinariness of it, that one small word that meant the difference between fighting alone and fighting beside someone who had chosen, deliberately and with full information, to die beside you. Yes, she said, we will. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence. When they arrived at the house, Clara was in the hallway with her geography maps and a question about the distances between Charleston and Columbia that she had been saving. Apparently, a return. William answered the geography question. Elizabeth hung up her shawl. Mrs. Aldridge appeared from the kitchen to say supper was ready. And in the particular, ordinary, extraordinary way of a household that has found its shape, that knows who some belongs in it and what the rooms are for and how the evenings go, they all went in together. The story that Charleston told about Elizabeth Whitmore changed slowly, a way all stories change, not overnight, not with a single dramatic reversal, but by accumulation. By the weight of the truth, added to over time, tipping something that had been leaning one direction for 3 years gradually, then, decisively, the other way. She did not watch it happen, She had learned, in the long process of the past year, that watching for vindication was its own kind of trap, that the moment you started measuring your worth by whether the right people had noticed the right things, you had handed the measure of your worth back to the people who had taken it in the first place. She had taken it back. It was hers. The inquiry concluded in the spring of 1820. 3 of the 5 transferred parcels were returned to Elizabeth's estate, along with a court finding that the transactions had constituted a scheme to defraud. The full finding against the Caldwell interests took 6 months beyond that, through 2 appeals and a considerably unpleasant autumn. The day the final judgment was entered, Elizabeth was in William's study, hers too by then, books on one shelf and his on another, and Clara's small pile of ghost stories occupying the corner that had always seemed like it was waiting for them. Marsh sent a letter. William read it to her. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "It's done." "Yes," William said. "The record says what happened." "In plain language," he said. "On file with the county court." She held that, the simple solid fact of it, the truth written down in a room that could not be undone. "Good," she said. William set down the letter and looked at her. The steady, direct look she had come to understand, over 2 years of mornings and evenings in difficult rooms, was the closest he came to saying everything at once. He said. She thought about it. Genuinely considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. "Yes," she said, and then, because it was true, and because she had promised herself she would say true things, especially to this man, especially in this room, "I am better than all right. Am exactly where I chose to be." He crossed the room. He put his hands on her face, the way he had learned slowly, and with considerable patience on both sides that she liked. He kissed her in the quiet way that meant everything and required no decoration. When he pulled back, she was smiling. 3 years, she said. 3 years, and a dissolved firm and a clerk from Columbia. And a ballroom, he said. And 4 seconds, she said. "The most productive 4 seconds in South Carolina history," he said gravely. He laughed. Full and unguarded, the way she had almost forgotten she could laugh, the way Clara had told her once with the frank assessment of a 10-year-old who noticed everything that she had a good one and should use it more. From upstairs they heard Clara's footsteps crossing toward the top of the stairs. "Are you done with the serious thing?" Clara called down. William said, "Did it go well?" "Very well," Elizabeth said. A pause from the top of the stairs. Then, with the satisfied matter-of-factness of someone who had expected this outcome and was simply confirming it, "Good. Mrs. Aldridge says supper is in an hour, and I want to show Miss Whitmore what I found in the second ghost story." "She is Mrs. Harrington now," William said. "You can call her that." Another pause. "I know," Clara said. "I just like saying Miss Whitmore. It sounds like her. A beat. Can she come up now?" Let William. He was watching her with the expression she had decided, some months ago, was her favorite of all his expressions, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile. The one that showed up when he was looking at something he was glad existed. "Go," he said. She went up the stairs. She went to the room where Clara was sitting with a book and maps and the small china horse on the windowsill, and she sat beside her on the bench that was just wide enough for two. And Clara showed her the passage in the second ghost story that she had been saving, and Elizabeth read it with the appropriate seriousness that the subject demanded. Outside, the spring evening was coming in easy and slow. The truth was on the record. The story had been corrected. And Elizabeth Harrington was exactly where she had chosen to be, sitting beside a child who trusted her, in a house that had made room for her, on the other side of the hardest 3 years of her life. She was not rescued. She had never needed rescuing. She had needed someone to sit still long enough to hear the truth. She had found in the same moment and through the same 4 seconds of the most reckless decision she had ever made. Something she had not known. She was looking for a person who looked at the world with the same stubborn, undecorated commitment to what was actually true, and who had chosen, with full information and no illusions, to look at it beside her. That was not rescue. That was something better. That was the life she had built, from the pieces of the one that had been taken, in the company of people who knew exactly what it had cost and valued it accordingly. And it was in every way that mattered, entirely and completely hers.